Okay, everyone, welcome to our Truth Team webinar. I'm glad you're here with us this evening. This webinar is for people who are willing and able to go to the polls with us during early voting and talk to voters about the amendments that are going to be on the ballot. This work is super important. It's part of a larger campaign at Democracy North Carolina. That campaign includes research, media, messaging work. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Truth Team webinar. I'm glad you all could be here. We have people from across the state signed up for this and other webinars that we're doing for our Truth Team, which is our core group of volunteers who have signed up to talk about the 6 amendments that are going to be on the ballot at early voting sites across the state. This Truth Team effort is part of our larger campaign to fight these amendments. It includes media work, research, and other on-the-ground organizing, voter contact work, like phone banking, like tabling at festivals and events, reaching out to voters any and every way we can to try to talk to as many people as we can before the election about the harms and dangers of these amendments that they're going to see on their ballots. This campaign is important in part because we know that many voters don't know about the amendments. They're not aware they're on the ballot, and they're not going to know what they're walking into when they go to cast their votes this year. And voters who do know the amendments often do not understand the harms. These amendments are written in a way that deceive voters into thinking that they could be good things, and we need to really make sure people understand how much damage these amendments could do. We also know that the more people understand about the amendments, the more they dislike the amendments. So that is why educating and turning out voters who understand the amendments is a key strategy to defeating them. We are mobilizing you all, the Truth Team volunteers, during the early voting period specifically. Now that starts on October 17th and ends on November 3rd. But within that, we have actually identified high traffic shifts, the times that most people go to vote early, and we've also tried to identify what we think will be high traffic early voting sites so that we can effectively reach as many voters as possible. Your job is going to be to talk to voters as they're walking in to cast a ballot. And we know with this ask that that is not simple. Some people are in a hurry. Other people will not want to talk to you at all. But your single focus on that day at the polls is to try to engage voters in quick and informative conversations about the amendments before they go and cast a ballot. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight. We have asked you all in a poll how much you feel you already know about the amendments, and the results of that poll were pretty mixed. There's just one of you on this webinar tonight who felt like you really knew a lot of details about the amendments. The majority of you felt like you know something about the amendments. And then a couple of you felt like you really have a lot of questions and don't know much at all. So you're really looking forward to getting some information tonight. For those of you who asked, we asked, if you know about the amendments, how are you already talking about those? You gave us some answers and responses about what you're saying to people about these amendments that I would like to share with you all. So I'm going to put this up on the screen here. All right, so it's kind of tiny. I hope you can see it, but basically these are the varied responses we got from people when we asked, how are you already talking about these amendments with your friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members? I'm going to read some of these off. So somebody said, I mainly emphasize the shift of power that is excessive and taking place here to the legislature, as well as the discriminatory potential for voter ID. This person says, yes, I've just talked to friends and neighbors. I talk about how voter ID bakes in unconstitutional language to the Constitution, and there are no details about what IDs are going to be acceptable. That's a very good point and an important one to raise in terms of voter ID, as is this next point. Someone said, I talk about how the voter ID law was struck down by the courts. That's also something really important to emphasize here when we're talking about voter ID. We've been here before. The courts saw that voter ID was discriminatory and they struck it down in 2016. And this is good, how you're talking about how it particularly affects certain voters, including African-American voters, elderly voters, and young voters. Another point someone made is that all of these amendments, if they're that important, could be accomplished by legislation. It raises the question, why are these on the ballot instead of going through a normal process? Generally, I want to raise this one up too. The amendments are vague and they provide a blank check to the General Assembly. So there's some repetitive things on here in terms of how to talk about voter ID, but I just wanted to share that with you because it looks like you all are, in some cases, already having conversations, which is great. Now is definitely the time to be reaching out and talking to people. And I wanted to show you that I think you've got good instincts on how to talk about these amendments. And we're going to build on that a little bit tonight. So I also asked what kinds of questions you have about the amendments and want to share some of your responses to that as well, because I think that will help kind of inform the conversation tonight. So the burning questions that people raised about the amendments included, wanting specific information about some of the amendments, like the income tax shift amendment, how to get more information and details about the rationale for voting against, somebody said no, but against all of the amendments. And this one is, if we have limited time to talk to voters, what is really the priority in terms of the conversation that we should have? That's a great question, and it is something that we're going to look at today in this webinar, because you will be only interacting with voters for a very brief time. Somebody also was curious here about, is it really nonpartisan to say that we're recommending that people vote against the amendments? And I want to address that question up front because it's a good one. And yes, it is nonpartisan. Democracy NC, as many of you know, is a nonpartisan organization. And what that means is that we do not support specific candidates or political parties in our work. We focus on educating people about issues. We're an issue-based education organization. Now, the law says that organizations like ours that are focused and oriented to the purpose of education can take a position on a ballot amendment. And that's what these amendments are. They're a question on the ballot that voters have the opportunity to engage in. And because they are issues, and they're not partisan issues by nature, they're being partisanized by the legislature, but they're not partisan by nature, which means that we can and have taken a very strong position against the amendments. So I hope that we will address all of these questions in the course of the webinar. We're going to do our best to do that for you. And we're going to kind of dive right in here. So I'm going to get back here to my PowerPoint. And I want to go ahead and start by talking about some of the basics of the amendments. These are the things that you'll minimally need to know to talk to voters. The first is there will be 6 on the ballot, and they're going to be near the end of your ballot when you go to vote. That's important to tell people, in part because when ballots are long, like they're going to be this year with all of the judges on them, sometimes voters stop voting. If they have a paper ballot, don't flip it over and look at the back, or they get to races that they're not sure about and they decide, I'd rather not vote on something I don't know, so I'm just going to skip it. We see about 8 to 12%, sometimes higher percent drop off in terms of people not voting all the way down the ballot. So when we're talking about this, we want to be sure to tell people where they are so that if nothing else, they can look for these amendments and go ahead and fill in their against bubbles on their ballot. Each ballot is going to have the same title, Constitutional Amendment, and after that it will follow with a brief description that has been written by the legislators. And that description is very short in most cases. One of them is rather long, but they're very lacking in detail and written to be pretty vague. And then the voter will be asked to either vote for or against the amendments. So that's how they're going to be on the ballot. In terms of why we are not supporting any of the amendments, why we're asking people to vote against, we find all 6 amendments to be very vague, confusing, and lacking in important detail. These primarily, 3 of them are kind of aimed at political power and would give legislators a blank check to write in the details about how those amendments work after we have voted. That's actually true for all of the amendments. They are planning on coming back into session after the election, and if the amendments pass, or for whatever amendments may pass, they would then write the details about how those laws are going to be implemented. So we do not have the benefit as voters of knowing what they're thinking beforehand, and that's why we say it's like giving them a blank check. We also know that many of the proposals on the ballot are ones that politicians have attempted before. We already talked about photo ID, and that's an example of that, as is giving the legislature more power over judicial appointments. So that's what we're concerned about, giving the legislature unprecedented, really, power and control over our elections and our courts. The judicial amendment would let legislators handpick judges they want on the bench. We don't think that's a good idea. And the voter ID amendment would let them essentially exclude voters who disagree with them by writing in what kind of ID is acceptable. The tax break or tax shift amendment would permanently cut taxes for the wealthy at the expense of working families. And we'll talk about why we say that in a few minutes. So, because the amendments are vague, because they were written in secret, rushed onto the ballot, because legislators took away the power and authority from a nonpartisan commission to write what we'll see on the ballot and gave that power to themselves, for all of these reasons, some of these amendments have been opposed by all 5 former living governors, including Republicans and Democrats. They're especially concerned about the Board of Elections and Judicial Appointment amendments. Nonpartisan government watchdog groups, DemNC would fall into that category, as would groups like the ACLU, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, the North Carolina NAACP, Progress North Carolina, the League of Women Voters has come out against some of these amendments, as have other organizations. Constitutional experts and scholars have also raised very extreme concerns about the amendments and have written about those, and that has been covered by various media outlets. All 6 former Chief Justices of the North Carolina Supreme Court, again, both Republicans and Democrats, have come out against particularly the judicial amendment. And over 30 media outlets from across the state have editorialized against the amendments. By the end of the webinar, I'll show you a webpage where you can find some more information and sort of get some links to some of these articles in particular. So if you haven't had the opportunity yet to go to one of our amendment roadshows, do look on our website to find out if there's one coming near you, because that's a dedicated time period to going really in depth about the amendments, and we don't have that kind of time on this webinar. But I did want to quickly go over a few talking points that you're going to hear come up in the role play that you're going to see in a little while. First, I want to point out here on this page where I have the first amendment I would like to talk about, which is the Ethics and Elections Amendment. You can see this box here has the language that is going to appear on the ballot about this amendment. So you see the constitutional amendment title. This number won't be here. I numbered that for purposes of educating people about these. So we'll just say constitutional amendment. Then we have the for or against, and then the description here. A constitutional amendment to establish an 8-member bipartisan Board of Ethics and Elections Enforcement in the Constitution to administer ethics and election law. That sounds good to me. I like bipartisan. I think ethics and elections are important. So the question really is, what is wrong with this amendment? And I have a couple of points I want to raise to that point. So first of all, this actually does not create a bipartisan Board of Ethics and Elections. We already have that. This removes the unaffiliated member. There's only one unaffiliated member of the current 9-member board, and moves to a board that has 8 members evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. Now, you can probably imagine this is going to increase the chance of partisan gridlock and delay important decisions about voting and corruption investigations, which that board also handles. This also lets legislators change the Constitution to get their way. They essentially want to take power away from the executive branch, so the governor, to appoint members to the board themselves. This is a rewrite of a prior version of this amendment that was actually rejected by the North Carolina Supreme Court this summer because originally the legislature had planned to take the power of appointing to boards and commissions for all boards and commissions away from the governor. So the court threw that out and also said, you know, you've described this in such a way that it's misleading to voters. You have to go back to the drawing board and rewrite this language. So this is a bad deal. It's sort of dressed up in a different way, but at the end of the day, it is still a power grab related to ethics and elections. The judicial appointments power grab, we're also naming it that to try to be transparent about what we think it is. This is the language that you'll see on the ballot, except that I want to point out that here we've omitted portions of what you actually will see on the ballot because it's so long. And I have a slide after this one where you get to see the full language, and I'll leave that up so you can capture that. But this is a really long and confusing one. Somebody who studies the readability of different language rated this impossible to understand. So let's take a look at why this is bad. We know judges are supposed to be fair and independent, but this actually gives the legislature power to appoint anyone they want, including any political cronies, to the judiciary. A lot of what the legislature has done that has been extreme in terms of extreme voter ID, extreme voter suppression, extreme gerrymandering, has been thrown out by the courts. So it makes sense that they want to now control the courts so that they can have more control over their agenda, more power to push through the agenda that they want. This gives them the power to appoint judges that might rule in favor of their major donors, who come from things like corporations and energy companies, many of whom are in the headlines right now for polluting our water, dumping chemicals and hog waste into our streams. This also will bring North Carolina one step closer to ending our ability as voters to elect judges altogether. The legislature has threatened to do this. They talked about doing this last session. This constitutional amendment would make that next step easier. Again, I want to reiterate that all 5 former living governors and former chief justices of the Supreme Court have strongly come out against messing with the Constitution in this way. Okay, voter ID. Here you have the language, a constitutional amendment to require voters to provide photo identification before voting in person. You all probably know the most about this one. We talk about it a lot. Many of you are supporters who have been working against voter ID for a long time. I want to say about this amendment, though, that it's extreme, and we really want to emphasize this. The supporters of this like to talk about it as though it's common sense everywhere, and North Carolina is behind for not having voter ID. But the truth of the matter is there's only one state in our whole country that has a strict photo ID mandate in its constitution, and that is Mississippi. And Mississippi is not exactly a bright and shining star in terms of voting rights in our state. It's got the worst record for voting rights perhaps of any other state. The bad news is the amendment on our ballot is worse than the one in Mississippi. So it puts us behind Mississippi, and it would let legislators revive what is a discriminatory law that has already been thrown out by the courts, specifically for targeting Black voters. This gives legislators a chance to, again, try to think about how they can write a voter restriction that narrows the electorate and excludes people that they don't think support them and they don't want voting in as large of numbers. It could prevent more than 200,000 people who don't have a photo ID from voting, and this includes many military and elderly voters. That 200,000 number is data from the Department of Motor Vehicles, so people who don't have a driver's license or a state-issued ID card, which formed the core of our last voter ID law. This also creates what is a permanent voting restriction by putting it into our Constitution. It will cost us millions of dollars to implement at the expense of other needs. And I want to underscore here that our Constitution is supposed to protect the rights of individuals. And we have worked, advocates and organizers have worked for decades and centuries to make sure that our constitutions give people rights and not take those rights away. And this definitely is moving in the wrong direction. So let's talk about income tax. There were people who had questions about that one at the beginning specifically. So the constitutional language says that this is an amendment to reduce the income tax rate in North Carolina to a maximum allowable rate of 7%. So that would permanently cap the income tax at that rate. That's bad because the effect of this is primarily shifting the tax burden away from wealthy people to everyone else. The wealthy have already gotten some pretty good tax breaks here in North Carolina by reducing the income tax. The current rate is 5.2%, and we had a progressive tax system before in North Carolina where people who made extremely much more money paid more in taxes. Now the tax rate is flat for everyone of different incomes, and that means that when the state has to raise revenue, they pass on some of that burden to cities and counties, and they raise the rest of the revenue through things like sales taxes and property taxes, which disproportionately impact middle, working, and poor families. Like I said, they're going to have to raise those kinds of taxes when we need more revenue in the state, which is an inevitable issue. And that's really going to burden people who can't bear that burden, who have already borne a disproportionate share of the tax burden, and whose wages have been stagnant for 30 years or more. This is going to effectively not just raise taxes on people, but also shift us away from priorities that we use our public money for, like public schools and things like natural disaster relief, which we are really dealing with here in North Carolina in the wake of Florence. The next one is Marsy's law. It's called the Victims' Bill of Rights, and it's the constitutional amendment language is to strengthen protections for victims of crime and establish certain absolute basic rights for victims. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because this is really out of our bailiwick in terms of democracy and these issues. And the problems with this law are ones that it's really hard to understand if you're not a practicing attorney. I'll just say this though, victims do need protection. Nobody disagrees with that statement, which is why this law is so deceiving. But let's be clear about what this is. This is a flawed solution. It's something that a California billionaire is spending millions of dollars to push state to state to state, either to pass via law or to get into state constitutions. It creates a lot of delays and problems for the criminal justice system and gives us a hefty tax bill to boot. The estimate is that this will cost North Carolina $30 million a year. And the legislature has not put out any details about where that money might come from. We really do need North Carolina-based solutions for things like our criminal justice system, not a California billionaire's definition of justice. I have also heard from attorneys who do practice in courtrooms across the state that they're afraid that this is going to create new burdens for the prosecutors and the judges who are already overburdened in terms of caseload. And from lawyers who are on the defense side, giving victims the kind of protections that this law has given in other states doesn't necessarily help the victims any more than current law actually does, but it does put defendants at risk. And when we have a criminal justice system that we know is broken, that puts innocent people on trial, that forces innocent people into taking plea deals because of fears of trial, this is going to redefine victimhood and also make it a lot harder for defense attorneys to defend truly innocent people. And they need protection just as much as victims do. They are victims in a way as well. The last one that will be actually listed first on the ballot is related to hunting and fishing, and it simply says a constitutional amendment protecting the right of people to hunt, fish, and harvest wildlife. We want to lift up that this has been supported by the corporate gun lobby, again, sort of a national effort to push this in certain states, which means it could be used after the fact, again, after, if we approve it and it's in the Constitution, the legislators can write whatever the rules they want. So it can be used to challenge things like restrictions on guns near places like public parks and schools. It recreates protections that already exist in North Carolina and deceives voters into thinking there's some sort of new or attack in general on hunting and fishing rights, when that's just not the case. And political experts, people who watch campaigns closely, say that this is really designed to draw out the base of the Republican Party. So this is on there sort of as an attempt to get people energized and excited to turn out to vote. So that's a really quick breakdown of some of the details. I wanted to put that in there because you all had questions about that. Now I want to shift focus because I really want to talk about what you're going to be doing when you're out there talking to voters. And to kick us off with this, I wanted to do a closed eye process. This is sort of where I ask you to recall a memory that you have. And I want you to remember a time when a stranger successfully engaged you in a short conversation about an issue or candidate. This might have been when you were walking into the polls. It could be when you were grocery shopping and someone was standing outside a grocery store or another place. It could be somebody who knocked on your door or talked to you on the phone. I just want you to remember a time that somebody talked to you and you found it compelling. I want to know what they said or did that worked for you. How did they make you feel so that you heard what they had to say and felt like it was worth giving them a listen? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that. I will put that question back up there just for a couple more seconds so you can continue to think about that. And then I'm going to show you some of your responses. So you're typing these responses into your Q&A box like we talked about at the beginning. Okay, I see some responses coming in here. I'm just going to grab these and pull them over. Now I'm going to get these up on the screen for you. Okay. Here's some of the responses. They were smiling and friendly and respectful of my time. They were from a group I recognized or trusted. They were nonpartisan. I could trust their materials. Yep, that's very important for me as well. They were short and to the point. They didn't waste my time or go into some long spiel. Yeah. They asked me an intriguing question to get my attention. That's always important. We call that the hook. They weren't pushy, but they were passionate. I could tell they really cared. Yeah, I think passion is contagious, and that's a really great point. So I'm glad somebody lifted that up. Key was that they talked in a way that I understood. No more detailed than my knowledge. So I'm going to sort of try to reframe that in a way that I hope makes sense to the person who wrote it. When they were talking to you, you didn't feel like they were going way over your head. They were sort of really focused on talking to you as a voter in the way that you could understand exactly what they were talking about. Those are great responses. Thank y'all for sharing those. And I think they're really informative in terms of what we want to do when we're out there talking to voters. I think all of these things should apply to how we are out there, smiling, being respectful, talking to people. And what I want to do now is show you a role play where I role played with a staff member, my coworker, Raina, what it might look like to have these conversations at the polls. And I want to preface this by saying that we decided to do a little bit longer of a role play. I think this is a little over 5 minutes. And somebody pointed out before when we did this, that's unrealistic. You're not going to have that much time to talk to somebody. That's true in most cases, but we wanted to give you the longer version of a role play so that we could get you to hear all of the talking points that we would like you to use, and also that you could see how you might answer questions that people have about specific amendments without having to be an expert. So we're just going to interact with each other. We're going to do this a couple different times, and then when we're done, we're going to ask you again to participate by typing in some reflections and noticings in the Q&A. All right, so this first one, I'm going to be the Truth Team member. I've got my Vote Against t-shirt on here. And I'm going to be, I'm going to find a place at the polls where I think I have a good view of the entrance of the voting place. I'm going to take note of other people there handing out information, and I'm going to find a spot where I feel like I've got good access to people walking in, where I'm not running out in front of their car. I'm not crossing the 50-foot campaigning zone. Every polling place has a 50-foot border beyond which campaigners, which we're included in terms of this issue campaign, must stand. We cannot cross that line. So I'm going to make sure that I'm outside that line, and I'm going to watch for people that I have the opportunity to engage. So in this scenario, I see Raina, and I'm going to approach Raina and say, hey, good morning. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. How are you doing?
Good. You're coming to vote?
Yes, I am. I always vote early.
Cool. Have you heard about the changes to the state constitution that you're going to be asked to vote on today? I'm a nonpartisan volunteer, and I have some information in case you haven't heard.
I feel like I've seen some commercials. I've heard a little bit about them, but I'm not really sure what they all do.
Gotcha. Well, I can tell you that I'm going to vote against all 6 of the amendments. The reason for that is that you'll see this when you go in. And here's a handout that has information about the amendments on it. All of these are really vaguely written. They were put on the ballot last minute by the legislature who wrote the language that you're going to see. And they're pretty deceptive. They were written in secret. There was no public debate about them. You might look at these and think you agree with some of the issues, but here's the problem. We don't know what the details of these amendments are going to be. So voting yes on these today is essentially giving the legislature a blank check to write the rest of the language after the election is over. These amendments have been widely opposed. All 5 former living governors opposed them. A bunch of civic organizations opposed them. And in general, they give the legislature more power at the expense of other branches of government, like judges or the governor, and at the expense of voters. There are also some voter restrictions or a voter restriction on the ballot today. So like I said, I'm handing you this information. You can take this inside, but I'm also happy to answer any other questions you might have right now.
Yeah, I mean, the hunting and fishing amendment doesn't seem like it's that bad.
Yeah.
I don't understand why, voting for that is such a bad deal. I like to hunt. I like to fish. Why not put that in the Constitution?
Yeah, I understand that for sure. The problem with it is, again, it's vague, and we don't know what that means. It could actually be used to restrict hunting and fishing just as easily as it could be to expand hunting and fishing rights. It makes it sound like there's some sort of attack on hunting and fishing rights in North Carolina right now. That's actually not the case. And if we need more protections for hunting and fishing, the proper way to do that is through the legislature. Because think about it, if there are legislators in the legislature right now who don't like hunting and fishing, do you want to give them constitutional protection to write whatever they want and make it that much harder to turn it around the next time?
Oh, I guess that makes sense. I didn't really think about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of the problem with all of these, right? Is that they look good, but the devil's in the details, and they're actually a pretty bad deal for us when we get into it. So, do you have any questions about the other ones before you head in there?
No, I think you answered a lot of my questions. I mean, well, I guess the bipartisan board of elections, the bipartisan board, I feel like that's a good thing. We need more bipartisanship in our lives. Things would be so much better.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. Here's the thing about that one. We actually have a bipartisan board of ethics and elections right now. Oh. It's got 9 members on it. It's got 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 1 unaffiliated member. This constitutional amendment actually takes that unaffiliated member off of the board and makes it 4-4. So what do you think happens when it's 4-4 Republicans, Democrats?
Oh, that's going to be some gridlock.
Yeah, it deadlocks. It's a potential for deadlock and actually prevents us from moving forward in terms of passing things that help voting, like early voting plans. That's what that board votes on. And that board also investigates corruption charges against legislators. So think about that. Deadlocked votes on corruption charges. Politicians will never be held accountable.
Oh, no, that's not a good thing. Okay.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. I agree with you. These sound great. They look good, but they're really deceptive and a bad deal at the end of the day. So I hope you vote against all 6 of them. I won't keep you any longer. I know you're trying to get in and out, but thanks for talking to me, and do take this paper. If you take this inside when you're done with it, if you don't want to keep it, I'll take it back. We'll reuse it. But if you want to pass it on to someone else, you're free to do that as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your information today.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one. Okay. So that is just a sense of how conversation might go at the polls. If you have the opportunity to actually get in there with someone and talk about the details, or if you get questions from someone. We asked another audience for this webinar, what worked when we did that role play? And I'm again going to share some of the responses from people about what they thought worked well there. So some of those include that they liked that I smiled and asked a direct question that quickly got to the heart of the matter. I tried to do that. I think it's really important up front to greet people and be kind, acknowledge that they're in a hurry, which I did, and say, you know, this won't take long. They said I was friendly rather than confrontational. Yeah, I think every voter deserves respect, and we try to really model that at Democracy North Carolina, even if we disagree with people, especially when it comes down to issues like this and amendments that are so deceiving. It's important to be able to approach people kind of trying to find common ground. I offered information rather than a position or advocacy. I would actually say that I offered a position, but not up front. Up front, what I said was, I am here in a nonpartisan way, and I have some information that might help. When we got into things, I was very clear how I personally am going to vote on the amendments, and went from there to have the conversation. That's what the next person sort of said here is, I like that you personalized it with, I can tell you I'm voting against all of them. I think that's important for people to hear. That way they know where you stand, and you're having the conversation from a place of really having all of that on the table. Someone said they like recycling, and that refers to the fact that at the end there, I said, you know, take this sheet in with you. If you don't want it after you're done, I will reuse it, so please bring it back to me. Someone said they liked that I talked about everything kind of all at once instead of one by one going through the amendments. And I really did that because there's not time to have a conversation with someone to say, let's look at this. Here's this one and why it's bad. Now, if someone asks for that, definitely take that time. But I think if you start by trying to offer that, you might frustrate someone, or someone might feel like, you know, I don't know about this. I'm just going to head on inside. So we're trying to keep this general and use the general talking points that we've offered to help people approach this conversation about the amendments. Someone liked that I started with, are you going in to vote today? Because they felt like it opened up the door to conversation. That's good feedback. And then there's sort of just a affirming of liking that I sort of put forward an initial thing I wanted to say and then elaborated later. I think that's just good to raise up again. And then I think this one's particularly important, that I was affirming Raina's thoughts, but also correcting or explaining what I think is misinformation. And that's my honest perspective. You know, I do think these things sound great. You know, I'm not a hunter or fisher, but I have family members who are, and can see why thinking, oh yeah, let's go ahead and add some extra protection to that. It's a way of life for a lot of people. I get that impulse. And so I think it's important to validate people's impulses, because at the end of the day, they're trying to look out for their self-interest. And what we have to help them understand is that these amendments in many ways go against their self-interest and our interest as voters. So I want to also take a moment to share some tips with you from our organizing director, Cheryl Ellis, who has done a lot of talking to voters at the polls and voter registration and all kinds of things where she's engaging people in very brief and short conversations. So these were her main points that she wanted me to share with you on the webinar tonight. The first one is something she calls KISS, which is keep it simple, sweetie. And if you know Cheryl, that's definitely how she talks. And the whole point of that is, don't try to give somebody a dissertation when all they really need is to hear some powerful talking points. She really emphasizes that every time she talks to our organizers or others about the amendments. She says, you know what, be kind to election workers and all the voters who are out there, particularly election workers. You know, there are a lot of people who go to the polls to hand out information that can kind of be nerve-wracking because they're so persistent. They follow voters across that 50-foot line we talked about earlier, or that you saw me talk about in the role play. Don't do that. Let's follow the rules and be respectful while we're out there, even though we want to be persistent in trying to reach as many people as possible. We don't want to cross any lines. Dress for the weather. Truer words have never been spoken. It could be cold and rainy on election day. It could be hot and sunny on election day in North Carolina. You never know. So make sure you check that weather report each time before you head out and take everything you need to be comfortable. That includes clothing that you might wear, but it also includes things like a backpack and water bottle and snacks, depending on how long you'll be there. A chair if you can't stand for long periods of time. Cheryl says arrive early and stake out your spot. And you heard me describe that in the role play video as well. Getting there, trying to figure out where you can stand strategically to stand out from other people, but also have access to voters. And then finally, Cheryl's last tip is it is okay to say, I don't know. And I think that is especially true of amendments that are as vague as the ones we are facing on the ballot. Certainly use any and all talking points that we've given you at Democracy in C, talking points from other organizations that you trust, to educate yourself and to get yourself to a place where you feel comfortable talking to people. But at the end of the day, if someone asks you a very detailed or pointed question about one of the amendments that you don't know, just say, I don't know. And you know what? It's really hard to know all the details because there aren't many. These amendments are vague, they lack details, and many of the details are going to be filled in after we cast our ballots. That is a problem and one of the reasons that I'm asking you all to vote against the amendment. It can play to how you talk about voters, to be honest about not knowing, because it's hard to actually know everything in this case. Okay, I want to see if there are any other questions at this point about the amendment, or any remaining questions that you have that feel important to raise at this point in time. Okay, someone just said, you know, that was a really long role play. What would the 1-minute version of that role play be? That's a great question. You know, I think it really does depend on each voter that you approach, and how you end up talking to people and how long people will give you. I do think that I would lift up a few things. You know what, let me put this up on the screen so that everybody can see it. I think one of the important things to emphasize is that hook that we talked about, sort of that opening catchy line that you can share with somebody, is a really important thing for a short interaction. So up here, I've got a little shorter pitch text written out, and I think this first line, which I'll highlight, have you heard that you'll be asked to change the state constitution when you vote today? That's unusual to hear when you're walking into the polling place. It's not something that happens every time we have an election. So something like that, that's your own, that works for you to grab somebody's attention, is going to be important for those short interactions. And then a couple other important things that I lifted out of the role play. Not many people have heard about this. That's the problem. And then give people the quick information. You're going to see 6 of these on the ballot. They're going to be near the end. They were put there very last minute, and with no public say or debate. And then sort of talk about why these are bad, right? These things sound good, like things we would want to support, like the right to hunt and fish. You can name, you know, some of the amendments, and really do take out that handout, which I'm going to show you in just a second, and have that as you're talking to the voter, and you can reference some of the amendments that way. But actually, even though they sound good, they all take power away from voters or other branches of government and give it to the legislature. This is a power grab designed as things that we need. I'm going to vote against all 6 of them. Again, I think it's important to say that to people, and that you're asking them to do the same. And I think this line is one that Cheryl saw on a t-shirt somewhere, and it's really great, because if politicians can't trust us enough to be honest about how they want to change the Constitution, we shouldn't trust them with our votes. So I think that is a really helpful way. That's a shorter pitch, about a minute, if you talk at a speed that someone can understand. So I recommend something like that. Again, this should be your own words. We really want y'all to think about how you would personally talk about these amendments and share that with people, because that's going to be the most meaningful thing. I told you I was going to show you the handout that we have. It's called a slate card. I'm going to go ahead and open that and make it bigger here. So the way we've designed this is to mock a ballot. So it kind of looks like a ballot. On the front, it says how the constitutional amendments are going to appear on the ballot. So that's the title there. And what I was saying earlier is, as you're talking to someone, you can hold this and show them, here, these things are going to be on your ballot. They're going to be near the end of your ballot. And then you can flip it over when you're talking about why they're bad. And you can flip it over and talk about why they're bad in general. You don't have to go through each one of these, but just have this side up so that someone can see while you're reading. And then definitely hand this over to them and say, you know, feel free to take this inside, look it over before you go inside. And then when you're done, if you want to give it back, if you're not going to keep it, I'll take it back, but you can certainly also pass it on to someone else. We really want to spread the word about the amendments as much as we want to tell people at the polls. We hope that they go and talk to other people. I also want to take time here to show you the page, because I think this is going to address some of the questions I saw coming in. This is the page we've created for the volunteer truth team. This page is super helpful. I highly recommend visiting this after the webinar and spending some time here. It's got a lot of the information that we've covered on the webinar. When we get the recording up, it will be shared somewhere on this page as well. So it starts with the 6 tips to join the amendment truth team in your county. I'm going to turn my annotation back on so I can spotlight some of these things. Many of you probably already did this. At the bottom of the page, you can see the counties where you can volunteer and sign up for shifts, and I'm going to show you that in a second. This also gives you our general early voting location site. So if your county is not on the list at the bottom and you want to still work in your home county, you can click on this link and it's going to take you to the State Board of Elections, where you can find a list of one-stop sites throughout the state. This isn't going to load for me. I think sometimes you have to pick a county in order to get it to load, but that's what you do. You basically pick a county and it'll search and pull up the list of early voting sites in that county. So that's there on that webpage. That's super helpful. This tells you how to sign up for a shift and how to think about what kind of shift you want to sign up for. And then here's where you can download our slate card. So that resource that I just showed you that we want you to use to talk to people, the link to that is on this web page. Now, we are asking you to download and print these yourself. They print on 8.5 by 11 paper, so normal paper. We're asking you to print them 2-sided so that you can have the language on the ballot and the flip side, or the dishonest part, on the back, or the part that says why they're dishonest on the back. But if you have trouble printing these, if you don't have a printer, if you don't have capacity to print as many as you want, certainly contact us and we will make sure to get you what you need for your shifts during early voting. This tip number 5 has some just general hook information, a suggestion about how to approach somebody about having this conversation, and then some tips, you know, be nice, and some of the things we've already talked about on this webinar. You also see here, this link says all 6 amendments have received bipartisan criticism for being vaguely written. If you click on that link, it's going to take you to a page where you can look at some more information about, well, who are the people that have come out against the amendments, and some additional information about the amendments themselves. There are plenty of places where you can find those kinds of details. Now, I said I wanted to go over how you sign up for a shift. I'll also note really quickly, we have another webinar coming up. So tell a friend, have them join you, and have them take this webinar on October 17th at 7 p.m. They just click there to register. Here is where you sign up for a shift. So I'm just going to pick a county here. Let's pick Wilson County. So if you live in Wilson County or want to do this in Wilson County, you would click on that link. It's going to take you to a Google form that asks you for your information. So you would just type in your first name here, your last name, your phone number, email address, and then there's a drop-down menu here. Which early voting site do you want to work at? You just click on that drop-down menu, and depending on how many sites are open in your county, you'll have one or more options here, and you can select the site, and then you can select all of the shifts that you want to do. After that, if there are additional shifts that you would like to cover that aren't listed here, you can type in an answer and say when you're available, and that will let us know. And then you just hit submit, and that will come to us. And there's a contact here for any questions that you might have for Taylor, my coworker, who can help you navigate any issues that you might have with the form or with the sign-up process. So that is the web page. The link again to that web page is up here. It's democracync.org/truth-team. That's how you can get to that web page. So don't hesitate to spend as much time there as you need. A few final thoughts here before we wrap up. One is I want to be sure to mention our voter hotline. It's not your job, and if you're on the Truth team during early voting, to help people who have problems at the polls. We have our poll monitoring program on election day that is going to do that, and some of you are also signed up for that. Thank you very much. But I did want to share this hotline number with you in case you do run into someone who has problems. You can simply give them the phone number to call. So screen grab this or write it down now while you're looking at it. 888-HOUR-VOTE. That's 888-687-8683. If they call that number, they will be connected to an expert that can help them navigate their voting troubles at the polls. So I also want to mention, because somebody brought up the great point of, doing this during early voting is kind of late in the game, Jen. That's absolutely right. And I mentioned we are doing other types of voter contact. So if you want to talk to people now, we need you. You can text VOL, V-O-L, to 484848 and sign up to volunteer to phone bank. We're going to be calling voters that we think are pretty likely to vote against these amendments once they get the information they need. So this is not persuasion. We're not calling people and trying to persuade them if they're, fired up to vote for all these amendments. We're going to spend our time calling people that we believe are poised to vote against if they just knew about this information. So please help if you can do that. We have really flexible phone banking programs now where you can come in if you like a party and phone bank with other people. Many of you are in places where we have a Democracy NC organizer who is organizing phone banks. If you text VOL to this number 484848, we will connect you with a phone bank. You can also do it from the comfort of your own home with a laptop and a phone if that works better for your schedule. I also wanted to mention this campaign website, bythepeoplenc.com. That is the website of the larger campaign that Democracy North Carolina is part of, along with organizations like the NAACP, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, Progress North Carolina. And I went ahead and pulled the website up here on my screen so that you could see I'll go back to the landing page here. This is the homepage of the website. There's basic information on this about the campaign and the amendments. If you go to the Learn More tab, which I highly recommend, you can scroll down there and see the organizations listed here. I'm going to do Learn More up here because it didn't work on the bottom. So this takes you to, again, kind of this style or design of showing you what the language is on the ballot and then why people are against it. But what I wanted to point out is if you scroll to the bottom of this, there's this more information section right here. And this is where, we have a description. These amendments sound great, but let's dig deeper. Here are some commentary from state and national experts and newspapers that have editorialized against the amendments. So you can find links to over a dozen articles and commentary here. And we keep adding to this as we get more information. So those of you who asked, where do I get the detailed information about these things? I would check out this list. Also, Google is your friend, I think particularly with Marsy's law, because it has passed in other states. If you Google Marsy's law and find some articles, I know the Marshall Project has a good article that explains Marsy's law and some of the consequences it has had in other states. So I recommend doing that kind of research as well, in addition to relying on the information that we can provide. My last comment on that is going to be, remember that with the majority of your conversations with voters, both before early voting and while you're doing this activity, you're not going to get into the weeds with people. They just need to know the top line information, that these are deceitful, that they're not what they seem, and that is important to vote against. And lots of people from the right and the left, Republicans and Democrats, agree on that. Okay, I think it's my duty here to see if there are any final questions before we wrap this up for good tonight. So if you have any last minute questions, now that is the time to type that into your chat box. Somebody says, how do I get materials, i.e. yard signs? So we do have some yard signs at Democracy NC. Certainly if you're in the Triangle area, stop by our office. It's 1821 Green Street. 1821 Green Street. You can find us by Googling as well. And you can come by and pick up the yard signs and yard stakes that you need. If you do not live in this area and you are interested in yard signs or other materials, you can contact, I'm going to put the contact information for me and Raina back up on the screen here. Here you go. There's Raina Walters Morgan is my colleague who's sort of in charge of this project in a logistics way. And my email address here, you can email us about getting yard signs. We'll need to know how many you think you can distribute. We need to know your mailing address. We need to know if you are, what county you're in, because if you're in a county where we have an organizer on the ground, we can get you a yard sign through that organizer as well. Okay, let me check back to see. Somebody says, is it equally good for people to not vote on the amendments as it is to vote no? That's a good question. So I might have said this at the beginning, and I want to reiterate, the amendments pass if 50% plus one of votes cast are in favor of those amendments. They're defeated if 50% plus one of people who vote on the amendments votes against them. So it is important that people who are against these amendments register that vote as against the amendments. If someone chooses to skip these on the ballot, it just doesn't count towards the total number of votes on the amendment. So if 100 people, I'm using very small numbers here, if 100 people voted on the amendments in general, then the amendments would pass if 51 people voted for the amendments, or they would fail if 51 people voted against the amendments. If 100 people went to vote, but only 50 people voted on the amendments one way or another, then those numbers would change, right? 50% plus one of 50 would be 26 votes needed to either win the campaign or lose the campaign in that sense. I hope that's clear. All right, we are definitely coming up on time here, and I want to be respectful of time. So again, you have further questions, do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope this was helpful, and hope you have a great rest of your evening. Look forward to seeing everybody out there at the polls. Take care, everybody.